Video 8, Funding Your Project. Tapping into new sources of funding. Welcome to How to Do Creative Placemaking, a video series produced by the National Endowment for the Arts and Local Initiative Support Corporation. I'm Fenna Jaquette, and I'm here to guide you along as you learn from our creative team of placemaking practitioners. Okay, it's time to talk about money. Oftentimes in creative placemaking, we think that funding needs to come from traditional art sources. But when you are planning your project, it pays off to think outside the box. What are the problems you are trying to solve, and how are those generally funded? Here are some funding sources to consider when you are beginning your work. Partners' own resources. These are particularly helpful when trying to meet a budget match. Local LISC office and other local offices of national development intermediaries. Community development agencies. Municipal agencies. Neighborhood association. Local businesses. Local arts councils. Artists. Local and national foundations. Other sources of funding to consider. Who are your partners who regularly work on outcomes related to the project goals? What are the funding sources they tap? Talk with them about whether those sources could be approached for this project. Here are some potential non-art sources. Not everyone will be familiar with these sources, but if they are viable options for your project, one of your partners will know about them and can teach others on the team how to approach funders and use these funds. Let's learn more about how non-arts funding can be leveraged towards creative placemaking.
I've been working in creative placemaking for close to 20 years, I think before we started calling it creative placemaking. Before I came to LISC, I was the director of the Arts and Culture Department in a small northeastern city, where we really had a very limited budget for arts and culture. And so over about 10 years of time, we really looked at how to access a lot of different kinds of funding sources and leverage them towards arts and cultural development. And that really became the basis of our creative placemaking program in the city that I was working in. And then coming to LISC, what we've been able to do with the creative placemaking program is really look at how the tools of LISC, which there are many of them have to do with real estate development. We have Section 4 dollars from the federal government for community development, and we work with many different cross-sector partners across our network. So I've learned over the years how to really leverage creative placemaking, these outside sources of money towards creative placemaking. We all know in doing these creative placemaking projects, there are multiple partners involved. It's very rarely is it a singular action by one organization. And in fact, that's what the definition of creative placemaking really is. And at LISC, we talk about leveraging the following things. We talk about leveraging social impacts, economic impacts, and physical impacts, physical change. So in the social change realm, it's really about how do we use creative placemaking, how do we employ arts and cultural strategies to build more socially cohesive neighborhoods. And in doing that, we use creative placemaking and artists a lot in terms of planning work in neighborhoods and in terms of bringing people together in neighborhoods through events and cultural activity. And in doing that, we can also think about where do we leverage other dollars? What kinds of other dollars pay for those kinds of activities besides just arts and culture dollars? And so that's a great example of how to leverage maybe a planning process and the funding that would normally be used for a planning process into creative placemaking. In terms of economic development, there are a lot of different ways economic development is funded. There are workforce boards funding workforce development. There are economic development councils funding economic development activities and development of real estate. There are all different kinds of financing that's been set up to help with economic development. So all the projects, many of the projects in creative placemaking, if you think about your project outside of the arts and culture realm and think about what the project is actually accomplishing, and what kind of outcomes are going to be there. You're going to often see that those outcomes aren't necessarily arts and culture outcomes. They might be workforce development outcomes. They might be tied into an economic development plan that the city or the town has created. So when thinking about how to tap into dollars there, really think about how your project fits into that larger ecosystem of work. That will then open up doors for new partnerships and to access these types of funding streams that aren't necessarily dedicated towards arts and culture. So the Waterfire Arts Building in Providence, Rhode Island used multiple sources of funding to develop this building. The building's located in a tract of post-industrial buildings that were built during the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. This building was particularly interesting to Waterfire, and it was also really interesting to the city because it was a building that probably wasn't going to be developed by a traditional developer. It was the space where the American Locomotive Company built the actual big locomotive engines. So when you walk into the space, you look up and there's light everywhere. It's like a cathedral to the Industrial Revolution. So how fitting to have Waterfire be in this space, this sort of amazing organization, really, kind of like bringing light back into the city of Providence during its Renaissance or its, sort of like post-industrial kind of rebirth. So Waterfire came to the city, and the city, worked with them, and it turned out that there was community development block grant money available. Community development block grant is money that comes from housing and urban development from the federal government that is generally available in cities to city governments. Each city administers community development block grant in a different way. Sometimes the mayor has a lot to say. Many times the city council has a lot to say, or the city manager. But so that's the first sort of money into this project. So they got the money to buy the building, and then that money then leveraged a grant from the state of Rhode Island to match the city money, or it was the community development block grant money. So then they had enough money to start the renovation. The building sat on a parcel of land, and because of the industrial use, was just really tainted environmentally. Waterfire worked really closely with the federal delegation and the EPA and put in an EPA grant, and then leveraged a $3.5 million EPA grant to remediate the space. And then after that, the building needed a lot more work, so that they got the site remediated, and then came to LISC and actually our new market tax credit arm, and we're able to leverage new market tax credits to finish the development of the building. So those are 4 different sources of funds that people don't necessarily think about that are actually accessible for arts and culture use. Another tool that's available for arts and cultural development that many developers take advantage of, and housing developers in particular, is the low-income housing tax credit. This is a tax credit that's available to do housing development. Art space taps into that pool of money quite often. When we're thinking about financing real estate development, there are a few other options and things to look into. The low-income housing tax credit is one of them that can be used towards arts and cultural development that has a housing aspect to it that is affordable or accessible to low-income folks, which generally our arts community falls into that category. Art Space has used low-income housing tax credits for years to do their developments, and has worked with LISC actually to access those credits. We also work together to make sure that arts and culture stayed in the low-income housing tax credit legislation a couple years ago when it was actually being threatened. So look into that. Another one is tax incremental financing. These are districts that cities and states identify as places where tax credits can be accessed to do activities, including programming and, again, real estate development. So make sure that you're sort of following those issues as they pop up in your communities. So one of the other things I think is really important in creative placemaking when you're thinking about financing your project is that you want to make sure that you're tapping into your partners as much as possible. I think that when we look at how we get these projects done, we have to be partnering with other organizations. And so when you're putting your budget together, it's really important to think about what are those organizations bringing to the table. Now, they may be able to bring cash to the table, but they also may be able to bring human resources to the table. So as you're putting your budget together, particularly for an NEAR Town grant, you really need to think about, the staff time that they're putting into the project, the numbers of volunteers they're bringing to the project, how that project is going to be put together. What's the full package of resources that your partner organizations are bringing to the table. And then the other piece is what kind of leverage can your partners bring to the table? They may have relationships with different parts of city government. They may have relationships with corporations that you as an arts organization or an artist don't have. So when you're sitting down to think about how to put all the funding together for your budget, don't always just think about what's the cash that organization can bring to the table or what's the cash you can put on the table, but how are you leveraging all these other pieces of your organization and your organizational resources. The usual suspects for funding a creative placemaking project are, your local state arts council, your local city or town arts agency if you have one, the National Endowment for the Arts through the Art Town program, and then some national foundations are funding creative placemaking. You just have to do some research on that. But, those are particularly, difficult sometimes because you really need to make sure they're funding in your town or your city, that they're funding where you work, whether it's urban or rural. So you want to make sure that you really do some research on that before you put the time and energy into putting those grants in. But there are a lot of local foundations that are also funding arts and culture. You all probably know, as a practitioner, which ones those are in your communities. But you may also want to think about approaching local foundations from the sort of angle of it's a social impact project, it's an economic impact project, it's a physical impact project. Maybe there isn't an arts and cultural program officer or program at the foundation, but maybe there is a health piece of the foundation. Maybe the foundation's really interested in economic development, and that part of your project, the reason for your project is an economic development outcome. So don't pigeonhole yourself into these arts and cultural funding, streams. Really look at what these local foundations and local agencies and city governments are doing that your project aligns with in terms of its goals and its outcomes. So a lot of creative placemaking projects happen in partnership, as we've already discussed. And some of the richest partnerships are with parks departments. We've worked particularly hard over the last 10 years in the creative placemaking realm to kind of really educate parks organizations, the City Parks Alliance, the Trust for Public Land. They've been doing really amazing work at the intermediary level, really kind of bringing creative placemaking to the forefront. So many parks organizations and parks departments across the country really have actually been thinking about this for a very, very long time, but now with that extra sort of push, it's really on their minds. So I would really encourage you as creative placemaking practitioners to think a little outside the box with your parks friends. We've seen with Allison Orr and Forklift Dance Company, the Parks and Recreation work they did with the pool project, just is an amazing kind of transformation, not only for the public realm, but for the employees, for the people who use the pools. And that's a great example of how city government and a creative placemaking organization really teamed up. And that was much deeper than just getting a grant and doing a project. The relationship really got deep into there. It was really an effort where people came together with a shared and common goal around how to strengthen the relationships with the pools in the city. And that can happen anywhere, really. It's just a matter of thinking together and coming up with a way to solve a problem. And if you're working together like that, the resources start to come from different places. They don't just come through one small grant. All of a sudden, you're leveraging the time of the Parks Department employees. You might be leveraging a stage that they have to use. You might be leveraging the backhoe that you need to put the sculpture up. So really thinking together about those projects and allowing people to get more involved in your work really just opens up new avenues for funding and resource development. I just want to be clear, in all that I'm saying, I'm really talking from the perspective of an arts agency or an arts organization that's trying to do this work. And I think oftentimes we can be siloed as organizations and as agencies. At LISC, I'm in a large organization. Arts and culture isn't what it does for the most part, but it's part of a larger strategy. And I think it's really important that we break down those silos and that we as the arts people in these places really break those silos down and reach out across different sectors. So as you're doing this work, just remember, it's your job to kind of ask, to be curious, to find out how the other organization you're partnering with works. We as arts practitioners, as artists, we really think outside the box. We can see the connections that a lot of other people can't make. And so we have to clearly articulate those things so that, again, we can access the resources and the funding that they may have to leverage towards the project.
Thanks for joining us today to learn more about how to secure resources for your project. We hope you will take a look at our workbook that can be downloaded here for free.